Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
And happy Tuesday, everybody. My name is Marvin Schwartz. I'm the COO at HRSimple.com, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Unconscious Bias, Whether You Realize It or Not. It's estimated to take about 60 minutes for the presentation. At the end, we will also be offering SHRM and HRCI codes at the end of the webinar. Any questions that you have, feel free to let us know what they are. Periodically, we'll try to see if we can get some in during the presentation, but we will also try to get all the questions taken care of at the end. And if you want to watch this webinar again, give it a couple days and visit youtube.com/HRSimple, where this webinar will be, as well as all our other webinars as well. Today's webinar will be brought to you from the law firm of Kastner, Westman and Wilkins, and Meg Matakovic will be doing our webinar for us today. Examples of her work include conducting workplace investigations, offering counseling and coaching sessions for managers, supervisors, and employees, often as a part of employees' professional development and training in a variety of employment law-related topics. She's also been a member of SHRM's national faculty since 2013, active in Northeast Ohio community. Meg is a past president of the Akron Bar Association. I should also point out that the law firm, Kastner, Westman and Wilkins, write our Ohio Human Resources Manual that we have available right up on HRSimple.com. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over now to Meg for our webinar. Sorry.
Good afternoon. My name is Meg Matakovic, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to have a conversation about the effect of unconscious bias in our workplace. Just a couple of thoughts as we start our conversation together this afternoon. First of all, I will be referencing a lot of resources for you throughout our presentation, and I will attribute those throughout our time together as well. I don't have any connection with any organization that I will be referencing for you this afternoon, but I will try to provide you with a lot of resources to help with your continued understanding and awareness of this topic. And also, just as a general overview statement, as noted on this slide, this presentation has been developed really for informational purposes. I'm serving today just because of it, a genuine interest in and commitment to this topic. This is a training session, so while we're not providing any specific legal advice or any information relative to a particular circumstance, hopefully you would feel comfortable talking with qualified employment counsel or other professionals who might be able to assist in that regard as well. So with those couple of disclaimers behind us, I'd like to draw your attention to a first resource that I think is useful to a greater understanding of this topic of unconscious bias in the workplace, and that organization is Cook-Ross. It's a diversity, inclusion, and cultural competency firm. And as summarized well by Cook-Ross, an awareness of unconscious bias invites us to do a few things. It invites us to fundamentally rethink the way that we approach issues like talent management, employee selections, strategic decision-making, inclusion, diversity initiatives, organizational culture, and many other aspects of human resources, workforce management, and more at a variety of levels. My entire legal career has been spent in labor, employment, and human resource related issues. And while I litigated for a time, my practice has always dealt with the proactive, positive aspects of workforce management issues. And with that background, I think it's really encouraging to see that the awareness of unconscious bias, implicit bias, hidden bias, is gaining more needed attention than ever before. Nothing that we're going to be talking about this afternoon is new, but it certainly is real. I had been casually researching implicit bias for a while until a couple of years ago when I decided to attend a 2-day session on the topic of implicit bias that was offered through the Ohio State Bar Association. And literally during this session, as my interest was becoming more and more piqued in this topic, and I was thinking about all that I had yet to understand and share about implicit bias, I simultaneously received a voicemail message, as my phone was on mute, from an amazingly proactive employer with who I've worked for many years. And they asked me to come in to talk with their senior management team about the effect of implicit bias. And to me, it was one of those aha moments. It was meant to be, and it was meant to be that I could continue to research, prepare, and talk with employers about implicit bias and more. So here I am with you today, and Marvin, we really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation. So I would ask you all on our webinar this afternoon, why did you choose to attend this webinar? And I would also invite you to identify for yourself one takeaway that you have for our session. And while we go through our session, I encourage you to ask questions, present comments. Marvin will be sharing those with us throughout. And while it can be somewhat challenging to have a conversation, if you will, while participating in a webinar like this, it certainly isn't impossible. And so again, please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and Marvin will be happy to share those with us. I have a set of goals for our conversation today, and they can be organized into really 3 primary buckets. Understanding what unconscious bias actually means. And throughout our time, I may use the term implicit bias or hidden bias, but meaning the same thing throughout. We will also look to discussing the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace and benefits that employers, individuals, supervisors, leadership officials have in terms of addressing the topic. And then finally, consideration of tools that can increase our awareness of and address unconscious bias in the workplace. You may look at this agenda and think, oh my goodness, I have to sit here for an hour, while I look at this agenda and think, oh my goodness, we only have 1 hour. So I will try to strike a balance. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, because of time constraints and also because of the research that I have begun to do in this area, I will be referencing a lot of suggested readings, follow-up items, organizations, etc., that may assist enhance your understanding and awareness of this topic. For example, 2 great reads that immediately come to mind as we begin our discussion. One is 3 Keys to Defeating Unconscious Bias. This will take you maybe half hour max to read, but it contains a lot of good information. Another that I would suggest is a book called Breaking Through Bias, Communication Techniques for Women to Succeed at Work. It was written by 2 attorneys, but the principles that they describe are not specific to the legal profession, but can have a much more general application. Also, as we look at the topics for today's session, I would invite you not to think about this topic just from your own perspective, but also from the perspective of others. For example, people who report to you, people with whom you regularly interact. So what exactly is unconscious bias? What does it actually mean? Well, the American Bar Association's Commission on Women in the Profession recently released its report on interrupting racial and gender bias in the legal profession. And their report is titled, "You Can't Change What You Can't See." What an appropriate title in some ways, but I would submit that we can change, or at least start to change, what we can't see if we appreciate and try to understand better what unconscious bias actually is. So again, with all due respect to my colleagues at the American Bar, I do think we can change what we can't see. Unconscious bias is a preference for or against a person, thing, or group that's held at an unconscious level. And basically, it's just that our minds don't know that we're holding on to this bias. And I'll talk in a few more minutes as to why this is. But research tends to reveal that in spite of best intentions, people will harbor a deep-seated resistance to that which is different. Whether the difference is on something that is more obvious, like race or gender, or the more subtle types of differences, like background, personality, experiences. And it's also important to remember that bias can exist in a positive sense as well. This slide provides the definition of unconscious bias according to the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University. And basically, it is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, or decisions in an unconscious manner. And as noted throughout, that bias can be positive or negative and can affect everyone. So, according to Cook-Ross, they provide an interesting example of how unconscious bias can play out, and their information is a summary of research that was conducted at Yale. So imagine if an interviewee is rated higher simply because the interviewee is holding a warm drink rather than a cold drink. Or an interviewee is rated lower because he's sitting next to somebody in the outer office who's perceived as being overweight. Imagine if someone is less likely to be believed because they are communicating with an accent different than the majority. Or if someone's resume is perceived to be more impressive or valid if the names sounded more mainstream than ethnic. What if ideas are listened to because they come more from a woman than a man, or from someone who is older or younger than the predominant demographic of the organization? All of these examples come from the BARGH, B-A-R-G-H, study, again, that was conducted at Yale. And while these examples might seem that they are not rational, they don't make sense, all have been examples that have been widely demonstrated through substantiated research like the BARGH study. And they are just a few examples of the way that folks can make decisions every day in favor of one group over another without even realizing that they're doing it. Consider this. Less than 14% of American men are over 6 feet, yet almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Less than 4% of American men are over 6'2", yet 36% of corporate CEOs are over 6'2". Does this seem to make sense? Not necessarily at first blush. So when we think about our traditional model, especially for those of us who have worked in the areas of HR and employment law, we tend to think that discrimination is a conscious issue. That is, that people who know the right thing do the right thing, and those who don't are the ones who create the problem or the bias. And as a result, we can have a model that we could describe as kind of a good person, bad person model. And so sometimes a driver behind diversity initiatives can be, let's fix the bad people to eliminate bias and discrimination, etc. And clearly, conscious bias and discrimination does exist. So when we, as HR leaders, legal professionals, often start thinking about bias, we start by thinking about discriminatory behavior and corresponding legal protections that exist. So we can start by thinking about protections that are afforded under federal law. We think about Title VII, the ADEA, the ADA. We can look to state corresponding fair employment practice laws that afford at minimum the same protections that are afforded under federal law and sometimes more. And certainly the lawyer in me needs to remind us all that there are trends based on these legally protected categories, and oftentimes such trends are based on increased awareness, like the awareness that we're talking about this afternoon, consistent with implicit bias. So as an example, administrative agencies like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or their state equivalents maintain statistics based on these projections. And for employment law nerds like I am, we can watch the world go by based on these trends. So for example, where did we see a big spike in claims in the early to mid 1990s? We think about Bill Clinton, Paula Jones, Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, and we recall back to a trend and increase in sex discrimination and harassment concerns. Immediately following 9/11/2001, a corresponding increase in religion and national origin concerns. The Americans with Disabilities Act was amended in 2008. There was a resulting big spike in disability claims. But as we look at some constants, though, despite these ebbs and flows of awareness, we see a couple constants. We see that race has been and continues to be the category that often presents the largest number of complaints seen by administrative agencies such as the EEOC and others. And we see fastest growing claims, most often focusing on age and disability. So while our perception as to which categories might present the fastest growing or the largest number of claims for often conscious bias or discrimination, the reality may be very different. Another example of awareness. So often when people think about sex harassment, sex discrimination, bias on the basis of sex in the workplace, we often think about it as an issue that women raise against men. However, I believe it's very interesting to note that with the EEOC, of the sex discrimination and harassment claims that were filed in 2017, nearly 17% of the claims were filed by men. So again, awareness certainly can affect our understanding and our perception of the topics that we're talking about today. And we are, of course, all familiar with these legal protections against discrimination, right? But what if, more often than not, people make choices that may favor one group or another without even realizing that they're doing it? And perhaps even against their own conscious belief that they are unbiased in their decision making. So if we go back to that good person, bad person model that I referenced a minute ago, that is, we ferret out the bad people and we fix them. When we're talking about diversity and inclusion, the problem is that we will never fully address diversity because, as we're talking today, every single one of us has bias in some form or another. Why? Well, first of all, bias serves a purpose. We make decisions every day as to safety, as to appropriateness, based on our own bias. Why does that happen? Well, our brains handle way too much information. And so in order to manage that massive information that our brains have, our brains will take the liberty of looking for patterns, they'll look for filters, and it's kind of like they go on autopilot. They take shortcuts. Because without these shortcuts, without this autopilot, we'd have to sort through way too much information. But great shortcuts can have a downside. They see these patterns based on cumulative effect to things that we have been exposed to throughout our life. So for example, researchers will estimate that we can be exposed to as many as 11 million pieces of information at one time, yet our brains can only functionally deal with 40. How do we filter out the rest? We create these shortcuts. We develop these lenses that will make and filter things through. Communication experts estimate that we will truly only listen to 10 to 20% of what we hear during the course of a day. We literally physiologically cannot listen to everything that we hear during the course of a day. Listening takes concentration, etc. So again, we have to somehow filter out what we are hearing throughout a day. Just a couple of quick examples. If you or your partner was pregnant, did you notice how many more pregnant women you saw all of a sudden? Or if you're looking for a new car, how often did you start seeing that car in commercials or on the street? Now, are there really that many more pregnant women out there, or that many more cars like ours out there? Or did our perceptions change when we became more aware? Researchers have identified more than 150 different types of bias, and here are just a few. I just randomly selected a few. Beauty bias. Beauty bias is the tendency to think that the more beautiful or handsome person is going to be more successful. Halo effect, horn effect, consistent like with performance reviews. One positive point or one negative point will cloud an overall opinion of someone. Confirmation bias. That's our tendency to seek information that confirms pre-existing assumptions or beliefs about a person or a group. An affinity bias, a tendency to warm to people like ourselves. And again, the most remarkable aspect of all of this is that this can be so deeply buried in our unconscious that sometimes it makes it difficult or impossible on seeing what can be real. And these patterns, again, they can be so subtle, they can be hard to spot. So again, Cook-Ross provides another great example of this in their workbook, the Unconscious Bias Workbook. So pretend for a moment that you are interviewing two people, and we're going to call them Natalie and Jack. And maybe Natalie reminds you of yourself when you were younger, but for whatever reason, you have this immediate sense of familiarity. You like her, and you might not even be aware as why. You like her demeanor, whatever. And so when you ask the first question, she tends to hesitate a moment, and you think to yourself, well, she's likely nervous, this is an interview, and you pick up on that nervousness, and you want to put her at ease. And so you say something like, you know what, don't worry, Natalie, nothing to be nervous about. Let me ask you that question again. And that whole exchange maybe takes 2, 3, 4 seconds. Natalie continues on the interview well, she answers that first question well, the interview turns out great. You then sit down with Jack. There's nothing negative about you and Jack, it's just you don't have the same connection with him that you had with Natalie. It's very businesslike. You ask the first question, he too pauses, but you don't pick up on his nervousness. And you may even glance at your watch or glance at the clock on the wall. The interview goes along well, but maybe not quite as well as Natalie's. When you consider, a colleague asks you the next day how the 2 interviews go, and your response perhaps to Natalie is, it was great. I think she'd fit in well, good team player. How was Jack? Well, he was okay, I guess. The reality is for you, to your mind, that is how they performed in those 2 interviews. You may not even recall that 2, 3, 4 second exchange at glancing at the clock, glancing on the walls, giving Natalie the second chance to answer the question. To you, the interviews were exactly structured the same. You asked the same questions, you devoted the same amount of time, but the difference in terms of allowing Natalie to answer the question a second time and then not allowing that to happen with Jack, perhaps even glancing at the clock or your watch, is what researchers would call micro advantages or micro inequities. And again, neither of these is going to show up on an EEO report, but certainly played a role in that conversation. These micro messages are powerful. Joyce Tucker wrote an article called The DNA of Culture Change. And she wrote this and it was published in Profiles in Diversity Journal. And her exact quote in this regard is, organizations have done a great job at controlling the big, easily seen offensive behaviors, but have been somewhat blind to what is rarely observed. Listening with your arms folded, losing eye contact with the person you're speaking with, or even how you move your lips to shape a smile. In any given conversation, we may send hundreds of messages without ever even saying a word. Just like television or radio waves, these micro messages are just as pervasive, yet just as difficult to discern. And I think this quote of Ms. Tucker's really relates well as we're talking about raising the awareness of unconscious bias. Now, I recognize that today's session is not exclusively devoted to the topics of diversity and inclusion, but I just feel compelled to make a couple of quick comments about making a business case for diversity and inclusion, particularly as it relates to unconscious bias, because as we see the patterns of diversity changing in the 21st century, it's clear that an awareness of unconscious bias has to play a significant role. As noted on this slide, it's well established that diversity and inclusion will enhance reputation, job performance, etc. I feel compelled to say, though, in my experience, often organizations will treat diversity and inclusion interchangeably, and of course they aren't. Another great read to get to that point, Verna Myers is a renowned diversity and inclusion expert, and she wrote a great book, Moving Diversity Forward, Going from Well-Meaning to Well-Doing. And Ms. Myers describes the difference this way. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion means being asked to dance. And so when we think about the issues of diversity and inclusion, again, it's clear that reputation and financial and performance can be improved. There was a recent study from Ernst & Young in 2010 where 53% of business leaders agree that diversity will lead to enhanced reputation and financial performance. A recent report that was referenced in the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Journal indicates that companies with greater gender diversity are 15% more likely to have financial returns higher than above their national industry median. You do the math, and we could certainly go on, but I ask, what is holding us back from diversity realizing its full potential? And how does that relate to our conversation about unconscious bias today? Well, one thing I think it may be, maybe our mindset isn't as inclusive as we believe that it actually is. So think about our mental models. For a moment, using one continuous line, change this number from 9 to 6. So I'll pause for a moment while you think of that. Change this number from 9 to 6 with one continuous line. Well, for those of you who struggled, it's not uncommon to struggle, because the natural tendency of our mind is to continue to operate with the same mental model or set of rules that we were operating in. So in this case, the number started as a Roman numeral, so for many of us, that's how we continue to think. So I have a rhetorical question. Are there any mental models that might be limiting your thinking? So we've already spent a lot of time today talking about a highlight of unconscious bias, trying to raise some awareness of what it is, But as we look to solutions to proactivity, it's important to remember that it's not enough to say to somebody simply, don't be biased. And because hidden biases are human nature, sometimes it's easy to dismiss them as something that we don't carry individual responsibility for. But a lot of experts who work in this area, many of whom I've already referenced, some of whom I will reference in the balance of our session, do believe it is possible to break habits and to lessen or improve some of the effects of unconscious bias. But as with any change, any endeavor that we're trying to make change, it isn't just enough to throw a training program out there or have a policy there. It really needs to be a core of who organizations are. So to that point, Cook-Ross has developed this acronym called PAUSE, and it's a great suggestion in terms of how to think of that. The P is for paying attention. Pay attention to what is actually happening beneath our judgments and our assessments. The A is acknowledging our own reactions, interpretations, and judgment. The U, understand that other reactions, interpretations, and judgments may be possible. S, search for the most empowering, productive way to deal with the situation. And E, execute your own action plan. So today, consider making a commitment to have a moment to pause and to have that time for personal reflection. And thinking about how that might impact the way you interact within the workplace. At this point, before we go on to the development, Marvin, are there any questions that you would like to share with the group that have been received?
Right now, I think we're good.
Okay, thank you, Marvin. So how does exactly unconscious bias develop? Well, it can develop in a lot of ways, and it doesn't come about in a vacuum. It can come about from our upbringing. It could come about from media representations. There's an interesting study back from 2005 after Hurricane Katrina devastated areas of the South. And on yahoo.com, it showed an image of Caucasian people with food in the middle of the flooding with a caption that referenced they were finding food. I put finding in quotation marks. And there was a similar picture of an African-American man that featured a caption that claimed he, quote, looted food. Unconscious bias certainly can develop from our social experiences. It can develop from repeated exposure to stereotypical assumptions or prejudices. So unconscious bias in the workplace is, again, particularly problematic because individuals are often not likely aware of the influence that it has within their workplace. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of or taken one of the Harvard Project Implicit tests. If you haven't done so, you might wish to consider it. I'll caution you, though, there's somewhat of a split of opinion and some debate as to the test validity of some of the assessments, which I'll describe in a moment. But Project Implicit is a not-for-profit organization, and it's an international collaboration between researchers who are interested in understanding thoughts or feelings outside of conscious awareness or control. And this was established about 20 years ago in 1998 between the University of Washington, Harvard, and the University of Virginia. And they've set up this virtual laboratory to try to collect such data on the internet. And at its core, the test assesses how closely our brains will link concepts which then lead to unconscious bias. So as I mentioned a moment ago, there's some debate about the test validity. Some people opine that results might be used against an employer as evidence of bias in a lawsuit. There's a recent article in Psychology Today where the author believes that there's a mass fear that has ensued based on some of the results that, for example, might somebody be categorized or be considered to be racist or sexist or otherwise similarly characterized. So a couple of things to remember with Project Implicit. First of all, it's important to recognize that bias is inevitable for everybody. And any result of a project implicit test or similar test does not make evidence or accusation of prejudice. And that's, I think, bears worth repeating. The results in this test in no way are an indicator of prejudice. We all hold hidden biases. But research shows that automatic, unconscious responses can be overcome with confident, conscious and deliberate effort. And if you do decide to take the test, project implicit or otherwise, you might want to ask yourself some of the questions that are at the bottom of this slide. You know, what's your reaction to the test? Did you have any resistance to the test? There's a great story in the book Blind Spot. It's another book that I recommend, by the way. The book is called Blind Spot. And the researchers of this book reported on a test that could reveal possible hidden biases. And the test related to the participants' relative preference to two American cultural icons, Oprah Winfrey and Martha Stewart. And after taking the test, one participant sent the following email. Dear Harvard people, there's no way that I prefer Martha Stewart over Oprah Winfrey. Please fix your tests. Sincerely, Frank. Now, we all know what Frank means, right? Frank, in his common understanding of the term, knows that his fondness for Oprah exceeds that of his fondness for Martha. To Frank, it's simply unbelievable that he could possess a preference over which something he has no conscious knowledge. Yet it must be the test that needs fixed. Yet project implicit tests and similar tests allow us to look into these hidden bias blind spots to help us discover what they contain. There's an interesting corollary that happens with this too, that sometimes we will either at a conscious or unconscious level categorize some of these differences as us versus them. And when we think about us versus them, we can think about perhaps how our understanding may be impacted as well. So, for example, when you look at this particular slide, as we segue on, what do you see? What do you see when you look at these two tabletops? Well, as the authors of Blind Spot will note, these tables are exactly the same shape and size, right? Well, if you don't believe me, you might want to try it for yourself. If you would trace the outline of one of these tabletops and hold it over the other, you will see that indeed these tabletops are the same shape and size. What this table spot shows us about is, or excuse me, this table exercise rather, shows us about is a concept called Mindbugs. And Mindbugs are simply an error in the mind's ability to perceive objects exactly as they are. And these mind bugs are ingrained habits of thought that can lead to errors in how we make decisions, etc. So without getting into too much detail as to why, and quite candidly, it's because I don't understand exactly the scientific reasons why, suffice it to say that your retina actually sees these two tabletops quite accurately. Yet when your eye transmits information to the brain, that's where the trouble begins. And what's even more interesting to me, even once we have the knowledge that the two tables have identical surface areas, it doesn't necessarily have any corrective effect on diminishing the illusion. So exactly what is the impact of hidden bias in our workplaces? Impact on our diversity and inclusion efforts, on effective recruiting, on eliminating unnecessary turnover, on shaping an organizational culture, on skewing talent and performance reviews. It can affect who gets promoted, who gets developed, and then unwittingly can undermine an organization's culture. And of course, it certainly can affect legal risks. So when we look as HR, talent management, other leadership professionals, we want to ask the question, to what extent is our organization culture, are our businesses affected by unconscious bias? Just a couple of quick research studies in that regard. There's a fairly famous study, the Thomas Myers study, that was conducted by Nexian, a leadership consulting firm. And the Thomas Myers study involved 60 partners from 22 law firms of various sizes. And this group of diverse partners were asked to review a memo that contained 22 errors, and the memo was written by a third-year associate, Thomas Meyer. Now, some of the 22 errors were substantive, while others were simply grammatical or typographical. Half of the people who were asked to review Thomas's memo were told that Thomas was Caucasian, while the other half were told he was African American. The Caucasian Thomas received a 4.1 out of 5 score on his memo, while the African American Thomas received a score of 3.2 out of 5. The memos contained the exact same amount of spelling errors, yet the group analyzing the Black Thomas's memo found more spelling errors than the group with the White Thomas memo. There was an interesting study performed by Fortune magazine, where a linguist analyzed the language of 248 performance reviews from a group of 180 individuals, 105 men and 75 women, who worked for a variety of organizations. And the linguist was asked to consider whether the tone or the content of the reviews differed on the basis of gender. And one finding of this report revealed that women were more likely to receive critical feedback than men. The study found that 58.9% of male reviews contained critical feedback as compared to 87.9% of women. And even when there was constructive feedback, the women's reviews tended to receive a sharper element that was absent from the men's. So, for example, the word abrasive appeared 17 times in female reviews while failing to appear once in the male reviews. Oh, and speaking of gender, I recently read a fascinating report about the composition of men and women in leadership roles. According to Maureen Fitzgerald, who's a PhD who has researched a fair amount on the topic of unconscious bias, women have been graduating in equal numbers from colleges and universities over the past 20 years. Yet women make up 5% of CEOs in the US, 20% of elected representatives, 25% of the highest academic leaders, and as recently as a year and a half ago, of the top 1,500 organizations in the US, there are more CEOs with the first name of John than women CEOs. Okay, so let's talk now about some tools for addressing this unconscious bias, and this is where we'll spend the balance of our time. So first, we consider ourselves. A Google researcher recently suggested to his colleagues on the topic of hidden bias, identify just one topic that resonates with you. And so I would ask with you, in our remaining section, identify just one topic that resonates with you. Think about if we each could implement just one item, think about the progress that we all could make. Find ways to hold yourself accountable. For example, research shows that if you write something down, rather than just think it through, you're more likely to be held accountable with real results. I recently read an interesting article in Forbes about a vice president for HR of an international medical research and diagnostics corporation who very candidly admitted her own bias against other women. And the story is rather lengthy in terms of how it happened, but what the telling part to me was, as she went through this process and she was able to identify a bias that she truly did not know that she possessed, her quote to Forbes was this: "I am a woman leader and provider, yet simultaneously I have discovered I have a bias against women leaders and I don't see them as providers." She went on to say, "It was one of the most humbling moments of my life to realize that I could have a bias that was counter to everything that I stand for." And I would say, kudos to her for holding herself accountable. You remember Verna Myers, whose diversity book I mentioned a few minutes ago? During a recent talk on implicit bias, Ms. Myers recalled being on a flight where the pre-flight information came from the captain, and it was a woman whose voice came through the announcement who was piloting the plane. And Ms. Myers says that she said to herself, "Yes, a woman pilot." Shortly into the flight, though, Ms. Myers reports that they hit some turbulence. And she said she thought to herself, boy, I hope that she can drive this plane through this. Ms. Myers then said she caught herself thinking, wow, I've never asked myself during a patch of turbulence where there was a male pilot, I hope this male pilot can drive. So in addition to just saying holding ourselves accountable, how do we do that? Well, one thing to do is keep track of surprises. For example, when you're driving home tonight, if you get behind a really slow-moving car and you pass it, do you expect to see an older person driving it? Identify and own our own biases. So consider reflection consultation with trusted colleagues. This process can take personal courage. It can take also a willingness to consider potentially unwelcome aspects of our mental framework. But by being willing to have that first step, sometimes we can step past the discomfort and begin to acknowledge and eliminate our own blind spots. Be willing to be open to different perspectives. And doesn't it make sense that when we do this, it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily agree with or accept the different perspective. It just means that we're willing to entertain it. There's a great book called What If? Short Stories to Spark Diversity Dialogue. And the authors suggest one great practice to see the world through a different set of lenses. Like when you're going on a walk this evening, look at your neighborhood from the perspective of a small child, or from the perspective of a different socioeconomic class than you are, or a different race. Again, practice looking at the world through a different set of lenses. As the What If author reminds us, it was Aristotle who said, the measure of a wise person is the ability to entertain new ideas without necessarily having to accept them. And while awareness is necessary, it's not alone sufficient to interrupt unconscious bias. There needs to be behavioral change, and we need to demonstrate this desired behavior. True leaders will demonstrate behavior worth following. When I first found this quote a couple years ago, it was attributed as anonymous, and when I first read it, I thought it probably was an Aristotle type person. And it probably really was, but this is attributed now to the founder of the Bilo stores, a senior official with the Bilo stores. But be careful of your thoughts, because for your thoughts become your words, your deeds, your habits, your character, your destiny. Some other tools for addressing hidden bias. Ask for and truly want feedback. Ask trusted colleagues for a 360 assessment, which I'm sure, as many of you know, is feedback solicited from 360 surrounding an employee. That is, an employee's subordinates, peers or colleagues, supervisors, as well as a self-evaluation. Listening to all voices equally, and if you suspect someone's contribution has been marginalized or ignored or misappropriated unfairly, to feel free to speak up. I was in a recent client meeting where I saw a great example of that. Shortly after one individual, let's call her Jane, had presented an idea to the group, the idea was restated by another colleague, we'll call her Claire, with no attribution of the idea to Jane. And on the heels of what I'll call identity theft, the person leading the meeting said something to the effect of, "Thanks so much, Claire, for restating Jane's idea. I too agree it's an idea worthy of restatement and reinforcement." I found this to be a really respectful way, yet a direct way, of pointing out the misappropriation of somebody else's ideas. According to Ernst & Young, you might want to ask yourselves these questions in terms of how you are interacting as well. All right, we're talking about holding ourselves accountable. Now, what do we do in terms of holding others accountable? And on this slide, just a few suggestions that may assist in this regard. For example, Google recently highlighted some of its internal research during a training session on unconscious bias. And as an example, one of their research results reveals that when responding to a position opening, on average, women will wait to meet more of the requirements on a job description than men will. Another example, during a recent engagement initiative of the American Alliance of Museums, it was reported that collaborates in a job description may be more attractive to female candidates, where drives results may draw in more male candidates. So in addition to all the reasons with which we as HR and legal professionals are already aware, here's another reason why it's so important to effectively review job descriptions, including the corresponding potential effect of our word choices. Making sure that others justify their decisions. So when we think about collective decision making, for example, a hiring committee, a two-tiered corrective action process, a one-up performance review. In this regard, consider reading the book, The Wisdom of Crowds. It's another excellent read. Creating safe spaces for difficult conversations. So two quick research examples to give you here. The Neuro Leadership Institute of New York found that when employees feel safe, there is more to discuss issues like racism, for example, and exploring whether racial biases are negatively affecting work. The conversations are more likely to have sustainable and lasting impact if they feel safe, if the participants feel safe. The New York Center for Talent Innovation, its research reveals that 38% of African American professionals felt that it was unacceptable to speak up at their companies about their experience of bias. Offering training is really important, but you want to avoid some of those training traps. As a related example, I conduct a lot of harassment and professionalism training for employers, but I firmly believe that the goals of an effective workplace, professional workplace, positive workplace, can't be effectively accomplished if it is a one and done training program. This really needs to be part of an organization's DNA, so to speak. There really has to be leadership buy-in. It can't come off like it's just a check the box kind of program. So really important to do that as well. I think I will pause here for a moment. I think, Marvin, there may be a question that is presented.
Yes, I do have a question here. It says, how do you identify bias in job postings and employment forms?
Okay, so the question is, how do we identify bias in job postings and employment forms? I think some of what we're talking about here today may raise some of that awareness, like word choices that we're using. I think also having perhaps a separate set of eyes, and this is not a sales pitch for your HR professionals, for your employment counsel, a variety of other professionals who you might use, but sometimes having a different set of eyes might be helpful as well. While it might be the first time you have looked at creating a job description through this lens, by involving other professionals, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be the first time they've looked at it. And to continue just having conversations like today, I think could be useful as well. Marvin, that comment too, or that question rather, is a great segue to this next slide. I think that, whether you're looking at postings, applications, but all sorts of employment documents, employment manuals, policies and procedures, looking at the language. So, are they gender balanced? Are there accommodation options? Those kind of issues. But also then looking at the effect. So if you're looking at an application and wondering, is it really yielding the type of applicant pool that I want? Is it how we're presenting it? I think that's worthy of a conversation or a question as well. As a related example, I suppose, when we look at the effect, I recently helped an organization looking at a paternity leave policy. So they wanted to be very proactive and positive, and they drafted well a paternity leave policy so that new dads could take leave as well. But when the organization dug deeper, they found that a lot of the new dads were not taking advantage of this leave that was available under the policy. And the employer discovered through this research that the new dads actually felt that they were suffering negative repercussions by taking the leave, even though it was allowed, available, and communicated. So when we think about not only how something is reading, be it in the questioner's question that he or she posed, how it's written, but then also the effect. Okay. Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I just would like to summarize with just a couple of other quick comments and slides in this regard, and then be happy to take any remaining questions. Trying to encourage, or rather discourage, quick or on-the-spot decision-making when at all possible, and trying to make decisions that are data-driven as much as possible. Looking at how we might affect other changes within the workforce by involving others, perhaps. Before we continue on, Marvin, I think that you have another question here.
I have somebody who asked if you could please repeat the acronym for PAUSE.
Oh, certainly. Yep, I will certainly do that before, right at the end of our presentation. Absolutely, I will. So when we look at other tools to address unconscious bias, we would look to having a single point person within a particular department. Look at projects that support, encourage positivity and greater understanding. I recently did a session with a very positive, proactive steel business, and a lot of times we don't think of necessarily the steel business as being sort of positive and proactive, but this organization certainly is. And one of the issues that they had was, how are women seen within this organization? Steel is a predominantly male organization, and how are women seen within this organization? So, taking time sometimes to think about what can you do to make that happen. Routinely collecting feedback. We all know what exit interviews are, right? Exit interviews are why people are leaving. But, do any of us, or do many of us, do stay interviews? What is it that prompts individuals to stay with an employer? Certainly, employee opinion surveys and corresponding feedback are very useful. This final slide is simply some final comments that really summarize a lot of what we spoke about today. So before we officially end the time together, I will go back and repeat the PAUSE acronym as requested by one of the participants. PAUSE, the P stands for pay attention. So you pay attention to what is actually happening beneath the judgments and assessments that you have. A is acknowledge, acknowledging your own reactions, interpretations, and judgments. The U is understand, understanding that others may have different reactions, interpretations, or judgments. The S is search, search for the most empowering, productive way to deal with the situation. And the E is for execute, to execute your own action plan. Well, if there are any remaining questions or comments, I would certainly be happy to entertain those. But it truly has been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you today. I hope that our discussion has raised some awareness, some reinforced our basic premise that learning to identify unconscious bias is a great first step to eliminating it in our workplace. And we always want to remember, we can change what we cannot see if we do so through conversations like we're happening today. So any other questions, Marvin, that were presented?
I have one more question. It says here, a previous slide mentioned the importance of respectfully identifying bias when seen. How do you do that?
That's a great question. That's a great question. The one example that I gave of, respectfully, if someone is seeming to be marginalized or if they're being ignored, to try to respectfully draw that person into the conversation So like the example that I gave about, if someone's idea has been ignored and somebody else is taking it as their own, in a respectful way, highlighting that out. Sometimes it can't be that obvious. Sometimes it needs to be involving others with that. So if you observe something that you believe is inappropriate or not professional, respectful, consistent with the tenets of the organization, maybe involving someone else like a human resources official or a senior leader or other management official who can help through. But I think the more that we don't address these issues in a respectful way, I mean, I think that respect it drives the day for all of this, then it just is allowed to continue. That's a great question, though. Thank you for asking that. Anything else, Marvin?
That is all that I have.
Well, again, it's been an honor to meet with you all today. I wish you all the best for a very happy holiday season and a happy and healthy 2019. Thank you so much.
Okay, and if you hold on, everybody, 1 second, those that are looking for the SHRM and HRCI credit information, I will post that up in just a minute, as well as Meg's email address and my own. If you use in the question box, so we're always happy to see that. But Meg's email address is right up there on the screen, so you can contact her as well. Other than that, everybody have a great holiday season and a safe holiday season, and we will see you again in January. Take care.